Hello, my lovelies. I am trying to adjust this ever so slightly. Oh, I'm not wearing any makeup today, my beauties. I just didn't want to. I also haven't shaved, so you get to see Richard Lale au natural. Today we get to start a new book. The Gentleman Psychic's Book Club, that's what I kind of feel like. But I know many of you asked for Asmodeus first, but I decided that I wanted to read The Doctor and the Devil first. So we are going to read The Doctor and the Devil. Oh, it has all of these lovely postcards in it, these vintage postcards I forgot about. Not really, but, temporarily. So this one is a fun one. This postcard says, "We raised the devil." I like that one. The Conspirators. I like that one too. Little angel talking in the ear of the devil. From one devil to another. This one is older than it is. This one laid around for a while. This one is actually turn of the century, but it was not used until 1949. June 23rd, 1949. Paul, received your card. I had a nice date last night. Reached home about 3:30 a.m. Cool weather, Ross. So that's from Mr. Paul. I cannot read his name. Mr. Paul Nard. I can't read his name, but he's out of New York. Kenmore Hall Hotel, New York, New York. So there's that one. And then, who the devil sent me this with all good wishes for the season? I like that one too. It says here, this space may be used for inland correspondence, post office regulation. And instead of actually writing something, they just put the address. So this went to S.C. Nichols, Esquire, in Portland. And it was dated at 5:15 p.m., December 14th, 1905. Yeah, so there we go. 1905. This one is fun. This one is, "Here's to all of us, for there's so much good in the worst of us, and so much bad in the best of us, that it hardly behooves any of us to talk about the rest of us." It's some sort of clergyman from hell. And this is a fun card, too. This one says, "Let the punishment fit the crime. Reckless auto fiends." So these people are in hell being run over by demons who drive their automobiles recklessly. So I hope none of you are watching and driving. I would hate for you to end up in hell. However, my beauties, I am here with a nice cup of tea. If you have a nice cup of tea, you can dim the lights. You can, or pour your favorite beverage. This is really good. It's got some vanilla. It's got a little heavy whipping cream this time. I thought I'd try something different. Very good. So anyway, here we go. Without further delay, we shall read The Doctor and the Devil. 1894 is when this one was published. The Doctor and the Devil. In February 1892, I was conducting a detective agency at number 287 Broadway. The agents of Dr. Parkhurst's society not having been enabled for some reason or another, probably incompetency, to help Dr. Parkhurst out of the awkward position his sermon had placed him in, the late David J. Whitney, then a commission merchant at number 47 Warren Street and a prominent worker in the ranks of the Society for the Prevention of Crime, wrote to me asking to call upon him. The letter was entirely unsolicited, and was rather of a surprise to me. Although I had known Mr. Whitney prior to the writing of the letter, and had been engaged by him in looking up other cases aside from the Society for the Prevention of Crime Matters, Mr. Whitney wrote me as follows. Office of D.J. Whitney, number 47 Warren Street, New York City, February 20, 1892. Charles W. Gardner, Esquire. Dear Sir, please call upon me at once. I have a very delicate matter which I wish to place in your hands. Yours very truly, D.J. Whitney. I accordingly called upon Mr. Whitney, and he asked me to take charge of Dr. Parkhurst's affairs, which he said were very desperate just then. Dr. Parkhurst seeks to substantiate his charges. The fact is, Gardner, added Mr. Whitney, Dr. Parkhurst has unconsciously placed himself in an embarrassing situation. The denial of his sermon against Tammy Hall has determined him to substantiate his charges by a personal visit to the haunts of the elephant. Now I want you to look after this matter. Take the doctor round, but be careful and not shock him too much, as it might sicken him of everything for all of his life. I told Mr. Whitney that I would show Dr. Parkhurst around town if he wanted to go, and would agree that he was shown the heights and depths of New York vice for just $6. $6 a day expenses. All extra help was to be paid for at the same rate, no matter whether they worked 1 hour or 10. All right, replied Mr. Whitney. Your terms are satisfactory. Mr. Whitney then gave me a formal letter of introduction to Dr. Parkhurst, who, by the way, I had never seen up to that time, and took it to the clergyman's house, 133 East 35th Street. It was evening when I called upon the doctor. A servant led me upstairs into the clergyman's study. It was a commonplace room enough. It was square in shape and has 2 front windows in it, which overlooked 35th Street. At one side is a high case of drawers for filing of documents. A big desk, square in shape, stands in the center of the room. Near it is a typewriting machine which Dr. Parkhurst uses in his correspondence and in writing his sermons. There are a few easy chairs in the room, and a general air of a home-like comfort pervades the apartment. Dr. Parkhurst greeted me warmly. He said that he supposed it would be a very difficult matter for me to take him into the society of the vicious while in their lairs, owing to the publicity of his sermons had been given in public press, and owing to the fact that the photograph had also been published. I told the doctor that he must put on a suitable suit of clothes and change his appearance, as he would not be allowed even in a fairly respectable joint, for clergyman was written all over his face and garb. That's a good idea, replied the doctor. I had thought of disguising myself. I don't want to if I can help it, but if necessary, I am willing to sacrifice my whiskers to accomplish my desire. But as they protect my throat, I had rather not. Still, changing one's clothes, I do not consider a disguise. If due caution is taken, I replied, I don't think it will be necessary to harvest your lilacs at present. Dr. Parkhurst laughed. He is a very jovial man, and appreciates a joke. I must say that as a companion, no rounder is better company than the celebrated apostle of reform. When they talked over what places should be visited, which could be cited as examples of the moral condition of the metropolis, and also could be used in evidence, and I proposed that our first investigation should be confined to the 4th Police Precinct. This precinct is bounded by the south side of Catherine Street, Chatham Square, east side of the Park Row to Fulton Street, and thence along East River to Catherine Street again. At this time, it was a real nice hotbed of every vice that man and woman ever heard of, providing you can call vice nice. I told Dr. Parkhurst these facts, and from the general conversation, I soon surmised that Mr. Whitney had put the idea into Dr. Parkhurst's head to go round himself and find out what life in the slums was like. Subsequently, I gather the idea was borrowed by Mr. Whitney from a similar tour made by a celebrated Brooklyn clergyman several years ago. While Dr. Parkhurst and I were arranging details, a tall young man, blond-haired, dark-eyed, and dressed like a Fifth Avenue lounger, entered the room. He was introduced to me as Mr. John L. Irving by Dr. Parkhurst, who said that he would accompany us around on our proposed tour. Irving was a young man, it seems, a son of a well-to-do parents of social standing, who had offered to aid in the work at hand. On the evening of March 5th, 1892, according to agreement, I called at Dr. Parkhurst's home to start out on the proposed tour. When I reached the doctor's house, I was immediately ushered into his study. The moment I laid eyes on him, I saw that he was not dressed according to the requirements of the case. He wore a passé suit of broadcloth. The coat was cut in minstrel fashion. The trousers had the very aroma of the pulpit about them. His collar even was the straight clerical collar affected by men of his cloth. In a chair sat a young Mr. Irving. Did you ever see a dandy dressed up in his last year's suit? Well, that is the way Irving looked. His blond hair was parted in the middle. His cleanly shaved face was redolent of bay rum. He looked like a fashion plate of a dead year, just a bit run to seed. "I think we'll do," said Dr. Parkhurst in the most complacent fashion, as I started at the couple. "Do," I shouted. "Good gracious, sir. Clergyman stands out all over you. It sticks out 10 feet. Why, you couldn't get into a Bowery lodging-house the way you're dressed." "I won't do, then?" queried Parkhurst. "I thought no one would recognize me in this garb." Then I screamed almost with laughter. It was funny to think that Reverend Dr. Parkhurst had such vague ideas of what was necessary to disguise his identity, and when I looked at young Irving, I laughed the harder. He was rigged out in a neat business suit, a little the worse for wear, but which was better than the average mechanic wears. "My doctor, those rags won't do," I said. "But this is the oldest suit I have," artistly replied the doctor, forgetting that the age of the suit made no difference in the style in which it was made. "This is really the best I can do, too," put in Irving. I explained that it would certainly be necessary to change the toggery of the two slummers, and when Dr. Parkhurst, in a bewildered sort of way, asked what to do, I cut the Gordian knot by asking them to come round to my house at number 207 West 18th Street, where I said I could rig them out in a proper way. The Doctor in Disguise. We accordingly all went to my house, and I started in to make a real tough, as far as appearance went, of the doctor. First, I gave him a pair of checked black and white trousers. They were seedy, to be sure, but loud enough in pattern to make a noise in the next block. Dr. Parkhurst is about 12 inches shorter than I am, and when he got into the trousers, their waistband was about on the level of his shoulder blades. To get into his hip pocket, the doctor would have had to run his hand down the neck of his shirt. Then I gave the clergyman a shirt, which had been worn before and was not particularly clean. Next, I gave him a double-breasted reefer jacket, sadly the worse for wear, and then I looked at him. Somehow or another, he hadn't shaken off that clergyman air. I thought I could make him look a little more worldly by adding a necktie to his apparel, so I ripped out the sleeve of an old red flannel shirt I had in my room and tied around the clergyman's neck. Still, he looked the celestial rather than the half-world, and I was puzzled to find what was the matter. I got a brown, dirty old slouch hat out and put it on the doctor's head. It made him look a good deal more like a battered sailor, but still there was that pulpit air about my client. It came to me like a flash finally, when I wanted to fully complete the metamorphoses. "Dr. Parkhurst," I ventured, "I think that hair of yours queers you. Let me fix it for you." So I procured a bar of common laundry soap and rubbed it on the doctor's luxuriant hair, which curled enticingly down his neck. I never believed much up to then the theory that dress has much to do with the making of a man, for the liberal application of soap absolutely changed the doctor's appearance in a trice. If ever man looked the tough, that man was Reverend Dr. Charles H. Parkhurst, when I had soaped his hair from its natural curl to a sober straightness. "Why, if I was a cop," I said, as I critically examined my work, "I would run you in on suspicion." "Good," replied the doctor. "I would like that, if I was sure I wouldn't be recognized in the police court the next day." Then I turned my attention to Mr. Irving. His feet were as small and delicate as a woman's, so I made him put on a pair of rubber boots. Over these I had him draw a pair of trousers patched in the rear, which did not come within 5 inches of his feet, leaving a gaunt expanse of boot leg to stare out at the world. I made him don a shirt which had missed an engagement at the laundry 2 months previous, and then I put a coat on him which was in the style when Seymour was governor of the state of New York. Then I insisted on his mussing up his blonde hair, because if he found to be parting his hair in the middle where we were going, I knew there would be trouble. Then I searched round until I found a red necktie. It was an enormous one of puffed satin, and after I stuck a brass shirt stud in it, and Irving had put it on, I carefully examined my companions. I was dressed tough enough for anyone, but they looked 10 times harder. "I say," I remarked as I led the way out of the house, "your red neckties are a passport into any place we are going to visit tonight. Come on." Chapter 2. No one saw us as we stealthily hurried onward. We took the 3rd Avenue elevated railroad at the 18th Street and rode down to Franklin Square. No one paid much attention to us excepting a very pretty girl next to whom Dr. Parkhurst took a seat in the car, and who drew her dainty skirts away from the supposedly contaminating presence of the tough who sat next to her. After leaving the train at Franklin Square, we walked down to the notorious block called Cherry Hill, where so many murders have been committed in the past. Cherry Hill runs from Franklin Square northeast and parallel with East River. It descends abruptly from Franklin Square until it reaches James Street, and then it slopes gradually away. The part of the street which lies between Franklin Square and James Street is the famous Cherry Hill. All of the houses upon it are old and really practically are ruins, but they are places that once were homes of the fashionable people of New York way back during the War of 1812. Nearly all of them are 2-story structures with small panes of glass in their windows, and with green blinds and green fan lights over the doors. It had been the home of B.Z. Gertie, who was killed by a pistol shot fired by Danny Driscoll, the chief of the celebrated Waiu gang. In it are the notorious double and single-alley tenement houses, towering piles of whitewashed brick, and the sure and certain abiding place of typhus fever, smallpox, and other infectious diseases that it is the home of growler and mixed ale parties, the home of Italians, Germans, Frenchmen, the home of every nationality at once, for that matter. Slumming with the doctor. It's a place where nightly bleeding men reel out of alleyways and fall senseless in the street, and no one even takes a passing glance at them. Women's shrieks echo through the streets as often as men's songs, and such a little thing as hitting a man over the head with an axe does not even excite passing comment. It really is the fashion to do that sort of thing on Cherry Hill, and yet, after all, The Cherry Hill that Dr. Parkhurst Irving and I traversed is not anything like the old Cherry Hill of 10 years ago, when there was an average of a murder a day in it. But it was tough enough to satisfy Dr. Parkhurst, who looked curiously around at the homogeneous life that could be seen on either hand. "I suppose this is the slums?" queried the doctor presently. "Oh, no," I replied. "This isn't the real slums. We're in a bad enough locality possibly for an average man, but wait until later." Then I led the party to a saloon at number 33 Cherry Street. It was kept by Tom Summers, who really is not half as bad as his customers and the embalming fluid he sells as whiskey. I knew Tom Summers very well, and before we entered the place I explained to Dr. Parkhurst that Tom did a thriving business in buying pawnbrokers' tickets from people who had soaked stuff that was not originally bought by them, and which they found had been placed in their pockets by mistake. Probably they had accidentally exchanged nothing with the original owners of the togs, said the owners being temporarily incapacitated from objecting. I don't mean to say by that Summers had any guilty knowledge of these facts. As we entered the saloon, which is situated in a 2-story building tumbled down until it is a nearly ruin, the bar is at your right. It is a bar that is pretty fairly well furnished with glassware and does not look much different from any of the cheaper saloons of the city. A partition runs across the rear of the saloon. It's about 5 feet in height and conceals a 15-ball pool table covered with dingy green baize, worn bare in spots by the patrons of the place, who utilize it as seats when not otherwise occupied in more questionable avocations. The entrance of a stranger into the saloon causes intense excitement in the patrons of the rear. I smiled to myself to see the furtive bobbing up of heads behind this partition when our party entered the place. I do not think that I would care to visit that rear room in the absence of the proprietor of the place. At least not unless I had a battery of Gatling guns concealed about my clothing. My South Carolina uncle. I led the way to the bar. Behind it stood proprietor Summers, and I introduced the doctor to him as an uncle of mine who wanted to buy a watch. 1 second. I paused there for a second. I led the way to the bar. Behind it stood a proprietor Summers, and I introduced the doctor to him as an uncle of mine who wanted to buy a watch. "What are you going to have?" I said to Tom. "Drink with me, and with my South Carolina uncle and my cousin." "Sir Charlie," replied Summers. "Is it a whisk?" At the same time, the speaker shoved 3 glasses in front of us and took a bottle of Manhattan Club Reserve whiskey from the back of the bar. He also put a glass in front of himself. Dr. Parkhurst poured out a good stiff drink. It was one of the South Carolina drinks, by the way, and then Irving took his turn, following the doctor's lead like a little man. I had little experience in Cherry Hill whiskey, and I took a smaller dram. I watched the doctor pour down his drink. He did let it go in his inner man like a good fellow. I smiled as I saw the tears start to the doctor's eyes. He acted as if he'd swallowed a whole political parade, torchlights and all. Young Irving, however, managed to make less trouble with his dose. He got the stuff down, gave a gasp, and hurriedly poured out a liberal chaser of water, a breach of Cherry Hill etiquette that brought a smile of contempt to the proprietor Summers' face. For my part, I mentally registered a hope that I would be alive after taking my drink, and I swallowed it as if it were medicine that had to be taken. "That's good stuff," I remarked to Summers. "Isn't it, uncle?" Dr. Parkhurst gurgled and sobbed in his throat and nodded his head affirmatively. "I think you want to get a clock and slang, Cherry Hill, and Sing Sing for a watch and chain," said Summers, after I had produced 40 cents to pay for the liquor. "Oh, yes, I do," replied Dr. Parkhurst. So Summers produced from his pocket several pawn tickets, but when I said that my uncle wanted to buy a gold hunting case watch, he said that the boys hadn't been out of town lately and that he hadn't any tickets for what we said we wanted, but thought that he might have won at any time. Meanwhile, there was a constant run of customers into the place. Dr. Parkhurst watched curiously little girls and boys, not more than 10 years of age, buy whiskey and beer in bottles, pans, tin cans, and pitchers. If you want to, you can buy a pint bottle of what is called whiskey for 10 cents. After we had drank another round of whiskey in the place, we left it and continued our journey. "What a bright man Summers seems to be," said Dr. Parkhurst as we left the saloon. "He seems too good to be too good and too intelligent a man for this business." I did not tell the celebrated clergyman that Summers might be more of a patron of Madison Square Presbyterian Church without hurting him a little bit. As we hurried along, for the night was waxing late, Dr. Parkhurst talked very freely of his methods and his intentions. "How can you expect that in a city where children of tender years are allowed to buy liquor," he said, "where men deal openly in goods they must know are not rightly come by, that there can be any respect for law and order? That's the trouble. That's the burning shame. A civilization is being cradled here. Good God! What will the man be whose boyhood was lived out in the reeking pestilent hole? I admit that this is bad enough, but I want to see worse." I determined to gratify the doctor's expressed wishes. "Where next?" continued Dr. Parkhurst, as we strode rapidly forward. "Don't forget to take notes of all that happened in there. I look upon that experience as splendid evidence to present to the grand jury. An immortal bath." I led the way to Water Street next. You see, I did not feel like plunging Dr. Parkhurst into a crime all at once. I wanted to give him his immoral bath in sections. I rather admired the doctor as we hurried along. He had put enough whiskey already in under his belt to stagger a white cruiser sailor, but he carried his cargo like a man who was used to it. Irving wasn't as steady on his pins as the doctor, but he was far from being intoxicated, and I really began to feel proud of my company. In fact, I remarked to the doctor that he was a good drinker as you could meet in a day's walk. Dr. Parkhurst has a remarkable physical peculiarity when telling point is made. Instead of winking one eye, he shuts both of his at the same time. When I complimented the doctor of his capacity for holding liquor, he shut both eyes quickly and smiled. I hurried my little party along to Water Street, the red flannel necktie of Dr. Parkhurst fluttering in the wind, meanwhile like a danger signal just before a blast is to be fired. "Here is where we bank on your necktie, Doctor," I said, as we got to the Water Street. There were several houses that I wanted the doctor to visit in this street. It was evident that we were getting near to them. When one block we met at least 15 women who were manifestly immoral. All were of the lowest possible type of femininity. They walked about clad in shabby, genteel clothing, soliciting the admiration of chance people. Several accosted us as we passed, but we paid no attention to them. We halted in front of number 342 Water Street. The building was 3 stories in height. The first floor had originally been used as a store, but had been turned into a sort of parlor for the reception of callers, although care had been taken not to lose the mercantile flavor of the original place. In the front of the door stood half a dozen women soliciting people to enter the resort with the same air that Grand Central Station hackman asks you to have a cab. Dr. Parkhurst looked carefully at the women as we passed them, evidently mentally photographing them. And as we were passing, 2 of the women caught the doctor by the arm, and before he knew what had happened, whirled him into the place and sat him down in a chair. A big, fat, greasy, and not very pretty woman, meanwhile, had done the same for Irving. I, too, had been steered into the place by a black-haired woman old enough to have been the mother of Columbus. So there we were, a happy little family party. The interior of the room was something Dr. Parkhurst had never seen before. I am confident of that. On the floor was a faded rag carpet. On the walls were two cheap chromos. A table stood in the center of the room, and round it were half a dozen chairs. On each chair sat something that originally had been a woman. That is, we supposed so, as each gaunt figure wore an ancient Mother Hubbard, and answered to the names of Alice, Maud, and Clara. At least, I called them by these names, and they answered to them well enough. The doctor chatted with the women a few moments, and had no trouble apparently in withstanding their blandishments. Irving, too, managed to resist the pleadings of the hags to accompany them into some upper region, and we then left the house. After we had drank a glass of beer. I must say, said Dr. Parkhurst, after we had left the house, that things are going along swimmingly. I see now that I underrated the situation when I arranged Tammany Hall and the municipal authorities. The unspeakable horror of that house tells more than I could in a million sermons. I thought this is a good opportunity to sound the doctor on his views of the fight in which he was involved. From his conversation I gathered that he had not supposed that his former sermon was going to create the excitement that it did. In fact, that he, prior to delivering it, had taken no great pains in preparing it. He had thought so little of it that he had loaned the original manuscript to the morning newspaper reporter, who was member of the congregation and who had intended to print the exact extracts of the address, but who had found, when he reached his office, that his employers valued the sermon enough to print nearly all of it. If I had not been practically called a liar, said Dr. Parkhurst, I should not be here tonight. I propose to prove my statements to be true. In fact, this time Dr. Parkhurst impressed me with having no thought of omission, such as afterwards was claimed by his friends to have been seen the cause of the slumming tour I am describing. Nonsense, Dr. Parkhurst. At this time was only a man trying to justify a position into which he had foolishly placed himself. Afterward, but then, I'm getting ahead of my story. Our next step was to some of the dives that I know of, which were situated in Cherry Street. They were all located between James and Oliver Streets. Each place was really a saloon, each licensed by the Board of Excise. In a Cherry Street dance hall, as we entered one of the saloons at number 96 Cherry Street, Dr. Parkhurst hesitated in a manner that showed that he was surprised at what he saw. Really, I did not blame him. He saw a square room with a bar at one side of it. Behind the bar, a most truculent-looking ruffian. Over in one corner was a colored man playing the waltz on a wheezy old accordion. According to the floor were whirling half a dozen men and women, and really the women were not particularly bad-looking. In fact, some of them were almost pretty in the bold physical prettiness of abandoned female. The men were sailors, laborers, thieves, shoestring gamblers, and the class of wretches that upon the horrible earnings of the women who frequent the resort, nearly everybody was drunk. Males and females smoked cigars and cigarettes as they danced, and all hurried to the bar at frequent intervals. The doctor, this time, needed no prompting. He just walked up to the bar like a thirsty veteran and asked me what I would take. "Beer," said I. "Ginger ale," said Irving, at which I nearly had a fit, for such innocuous fluids were not popular in this place. "I don't think," said the bartender to Irving when he heard his order, you get beer, young feller, see?" And Irving took beer without a protest. So did I. While we were drinking, a short, well-developed girl, 19 years of age, I should say, accosted us. "Hey, Whiskers," said she to Dr. Parkhurst, going to ball me off?" The puzzled look that came over the face of the doctor caused me to rush to his rescue, which I did by asking the girl to have something on me, which she was not at all reluctant to name. The girl then asked Dr. Parkhurst to dance with her, and I again came to the rescue by telling her that my friend, indicating Irving, could dance splendidly. "Oh, Blondie," she shouted, "ain't you going to give me a turn?" In 10 seconds later, the rubber boots of young Irving and number 10 shoes of the belle of the place were tapping on the floor. The girl evidently knew her business. She danced well. I don't think that any of the Fifth Avenue friends of Irving ever danced a waltz of that kind. It was a dance in which vice and shame, brazen-faced, tried to thrust itself upon innocence in the guise of young Irving. Baby. Before any serious results happened, I managed to tear Irving away. Meanwhile, Dr. Parkhurst had been steered to a chair by two women, who had fixed their eyes upon him. And they were hags, mind you, women whose faces had been pretty years ago, perhaps, but which were besotted and stained with crime then. While the doctor was trying to keep himself out of trouble with the two old hags, the door opened and a woman came in to sell oranges. Dr. Parkhurst bought one for 5 cents. I paid for it, out of the funds of the Society for the Prevention of Crime, and calmly began sucking it, while the foul-mouthed crone leered at him. The music squawked a wheezy imitation of the beautiful blue Danube waltz. Profanity, filthy language, dirt, beer, whiskey, and cigar and tobacco smoke all nearly turned my stomach, but the doctor not only stuck to his orange, but he said afterward that it tasted so good despite his fearful surroundings. All this while the two hags had been entreating Dr. Parkhurst to buy liquor for them, and he at last acquiesced. This made one of them, who was a big, fat, 200-pound crone, become enraptured with the doctor, and she leered at him in the most sickening manner. The second woman watched this mash, as she considered it, with jealous eyes, and I feared that there was going to be trouble, although Dr. Parkhurst sat in blissful ignorance sucking his orange, and Irving continued to blow himself for beer for his lady friend. The 200-pound woman finally drank enough to make her coquettish, and she told Dr. Parkhurst that her name was Baby, and that she lived within a block of the den in which we were. When she gravely asked Dr. Parkhurst to always ask for Baby when visiting the joint, I almost roared. This byplay was interrupted by the entrance of the Corps of the Salvation Army. All were women, dressed in funny old-fashioned hats of the army uniform, and to the surprise of the doctor, no protest was made to their entrance. The 4 women, Salvation people, circulated around the place, offering religious papers to all the dissolute crowd in it. While the doctor watched them curiously, one of the corps came up to me, and asked me to buy a paper, which the organization publishes. I was about to do so when Dr. Parkhurst gave me a knowing look of protest, and then I led the way out of the place, followed by my companions. "I do not believe in the methods of the Salvation Army," said Dr. Parkhurst, as we left the vile den. "They do more harm than good, and I do not propose to aid their exchequer by buying their foolish paper. A grand jury indictment is the only paper that hole needs to convert it." And on that note, I agree with his musings on the Salvation Army. I have stories I'm not going to tell you here. Not right now. Anyway, Dr. Parkhurst's affidavit. Now, this may seem like a romance to you, but to show you that the visit was made just as I say, I present one trunkload of affidavits I hold regarding this first famous expedition made by the 3 actors in the drama. They are as follows: City, County, and State of New York, SS, Charles W. Gardner of number 207, West 18th Street, being duly sworn, deposes and says that on the 5th day of March 1892, at said city and county of New York, deponent in company with Charles H. Parkhurst and John L. Irving, visited the premises of number 96 Cherry Street in said city, kept and owned by John Doe, real name unknown, a deponent, who was solicited for the purpose there were men and women engaged in drinking, dancing, carousing, using vile, indecent, and lascivious language, and otherwise disturbing the peace. Sworn to before me this 12th day of March 1892, Henri from Notary Public. City, County, and State of New York, SS. Charles H. Parkhurst of number 133 East 55th Street, being duly sworn, deposes, and says that on the 5th day of March 1892, at said city of New York, despondent visited the premises of number 96 Cherry Street in company with Charles W. Gardner and John L. Irving, that the affidavit hereto attached of Charles W. Gardner is true to dependent's own knowledge. Sworn to before me this 12th day of March 1892, Charles W. Gardner, Commissioner of Deeds, New York Company. City, County, and State of New York, SS. John L. Irving of number 30 West 20th Street, in said city, being duly sworn, deposes and says that on the 5th day of March 1892, at said city of New York, he visited the premises of number 96 Cherry Street in the company of Charles W. Gardner and John L. Irving, that the facts set forth in their affidavits are true to dependent's own knowledge. Sworn to before me this 12th day of March 1892, Charles W. Gardner, Commissioner of Deeds. By a slight error in the preparation of these affidavits, young Irving is made to swear to having accompanied himself with me to the dive instead of Dr. Parkhurst and me, but subsequent affidavits were drawn correcting this error, and they afterwards were presented to the grand jury. The fate they met we will be told later. New York, March 8, 1892, number 133 East 35th Street. Dear Mr. Gardner, I was very glad to get your letter tonight. You must not wear yourself out with your work. It is queer the way you missed each other last night. All's well that ends well. I expect you at my home tomorrow, Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock. Yours very sincerely, C.H. I can't read this. Is that... Anyway... The letter came to me bright and early on Tuesday, March 8th, 1892, from the doctor, and its title history, which comes later in the story, to be sure that it was also a signal that Dr. Parkhurst wished to continue his expedition into the depths of degradation, and wished me to aid him still further. So then, I planned a tour which would throw into the shade, in vile association, the one I have already described, and which I shall now proceed to set forth in full. Chapter 3. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, after a most horrible night of storm, when our vice-hunting party, consisting of Dr. Parkhurst, Irving, and myself, halted in the front of East River Hotel on the southeast corner of Water Street and Catherine Slip. Here we were in the very home of squalor. It was in this house of vice that George Frank, alias Frenchy, was alleged to have killed Carrie Brown, better known as Old Shakespeare, on April 24th, 1891. The hotel in which the murder was committed is a common brick building, but at the same time we visited, to the moist, fog-laden air of the gently falling rain softened the outlines of the old structure until it assumed an indistinct but by no means ungraceful appearance. The entrance to the so-called hotel bar-room was on the corner of the streets which the hotel fronts. It was not masked entrance, where you pass through a stormhouse vestibule of a saloon. There is, you see, no necessity for any subterfuge about the East River Hotel. When you enter the resort, everybody about knows that you are there for vicious purposes, and concealment of vice is an unknown virtue in that part of New York. Scenes in the East River Hotel. So I boldly opened the door, flush with the pavement, and stepped in. The doctor followed me. Behind him came Irving, and I suppose that his satanic majesty was behind us, all probably wanting to see just how the doctor was getting on in such search for evidences of immorality and general crime in New York City. The room we entered was low-ceiled and most unattractive. The floor was pretty grimy with dirt. You could not tell whether you were walking on dirt floors or those made of boards. At one side was a big iron stove that it apparently never had been blackened in its heat-giving career. The bar was opposite the stove. It was low, covered with dirt, stained yellow, along its sides by innumerable quarts of tobacco juice, squirted upon it by thousands of customers. It was charred and burnt on its surface by thousands of cheap cigars and cheaper cigarettes. Behind the bar was a narrow shelf on which were bottles labeled in a mockery of the truth: whiskey, gin, brandy, and so on. At one end of the bar was a big keg of stale lager beer, the kind you buy for 50 cents an eighth keg, as that part of the barrel is called by brewers. A stale cloud, violet in color and choking in its strength, hung in the room, made by the smoke of tobacco puffed from the lips of patrons of the place. Through this, pungent and sickening, could be detected the almost indescribable odor of long-worn wet clothing upon dirty bodies. Ugh! It was beastly. At the bar, in full uniform, were standing two big policemen, pledging free rum, I fancy. The doctor clutched me by the arm and whispered in my ear to take the numbers of the two men to be used as evidence. I did so. The numbers were, but then, what is the use of reporting two poor 25-cent-a-week policemen when the certain captains, inspectors, and police commissioners we know of still hold office? At all events, both numbers were in my possession. The bartender of the hotel was a short, typical Fourth War drink dispenser. His bullet head was covered with a short cropped hair. His face had the sallow tinge born of late hours, bad air, and bad liquor. He chewed tobacco, and his lips were stained with a faint yellow, which made his mouth prominent and hideous. By this interesting group I led the doctor and his satellite. We made our way rapidly to what is known in the hotel as the stalls. This means that a portion of one of the end of the bar-room had been partitioned off into a space about 12 feet square. I should say no chairs or tables were in the room. Not a decoration of any kind was on the plain board walls. The women customers of the place and the depraved men they lured to it were accustomed to stand up and drink until senses gave way, when they were at liberty to fall down on the filthy floor and sleep their intoxication off. We walked into the room where there stood the most disreputable-looking lot of women I think I ever saw. Women were there once of the East Side middle-class world, but now hopelessly lost. Dirty. I never saw such dirt. It was caked and crusted on the hands and faces, hair tangled and matted around bloated, rum-flushed faces, clothing scant, soiled, ragged, and ill-smelling, half-covering gaunt bodies. Eyes gleaming with madness of delirium, tremens or faded from potent drugs, masqueraded in alcohol as liquor. Women lost to everything in the world except a mere love for liquor. Two men, as we entered the stall, who had gained entrance to the main bar-room as we crossed it, started to dance a sailor's hornpipe. One man played upon a violin which was wretchedly out of tune. The other one, to the air of Bonnie Doon, danced a clumsy, ungainly jig. The women in the stall, despite their ill-favoured unsightliness, greeted us with all signs of positive welcome. They fancied that we would buy them drink, something which I did at cost of 80 cents for 16 people. Yes, it was 5-cent whiskey that we drank. That is, the doctor, Brother Irving, and I. Our guests drank everything from stale beer to blue vitriol. Did you ever drink any 5-cent whiskey? If you never did, you are a happy man. It is a drink that is it is simply awful. It tastes like a combination of kerosene oil, soft soap, alcohol, and the chemicals used in fire extinguishers. I fancy, although I have never touched a drink of that particular kind of brew. There was no untoward amount of curiosity on the part of the women as to who we were. They were all so debased, so deadened to everything except the charms of drink, that, excepting the making of revolting proposition to us, nothing was said while we were in the stall. Yet, if the doctor said nothing, his eyes expressed volumes: disgust, pity, horror, conjecture filtered over his face. He was disgusted with his horrible surroundings, was filled with a pity for the wrecks of life around him, and was filled with wonderment as to how any person could become so utterly depraved as the vile creatures around him. He expressed these sentiments to me after we left a fetid hole and had issued once more into the hardly less foul, rain-swept streets. It was now, after 3 o'clock in the morning. There was a suggestion of the coming dawn in the east, a grey darkness flashing out of the black night around it. From the nearby docks, that line of the East River, could be heard the sound of men beginning their daily toil. Dr. Parkhurst stopped suddenly. "Here is a city," he said, as if the sound of awakening commerce had brought the idea to his mind, "which is now waking up to begin its daily toil for millions of dollars. Just one tithe of the money and the energy to be thrown away today in this race for wealth would turn this hellhole we are in into a decent place. How many of these seekers for wealth know or care that the excise laws of the city, the laws of moral health, all laws, in fact, are broken right here in this part of town? And mind you, this saturnalia of crime tonight is going on right under the eyes of the police. They are cognizant of it. Their superior officers at police headquarters are aware of it, yet they dare to say that I am guilty of bearing false witness against my neighbors because I have put my finger on the sore, and say to the police, 'Cure this spot, and you are doing your city the duty you owe it as its servants.'" The doctor, in 5-cent lodging houses. Despite the incoming dawn, we decided to pay a visit to a couple of 5 and 10-cent lodging houses for men only. We had seen how Vice spent his waking hours in the 4th Police Precinct, and we wanted to see how Vice and poverty rested itself. I hurried our steps to a 5-cent sleeping place at number 223 Park Row. The place is over 5-cent whiskey saloon, or dead house, as the poor wretches who frequent it call it. It is reached by a pair of dirty, grimy stairs that are a daily violation of the laws of the Board of Health. Still, such a little thing as violating the laws of the city does not count down among Park Row lodging houses. We climbed the narrow stairs, which trembled under our tread, up to a loft 1 flight from the street. A little square box of plain boards had been built in the head of the stairs. It was something like a ticket box at a theatre, but was made much stronger, so that the lodgers, as they passed by, could not rob the man who took their nickels out for a night's lodging, that little pleasantry being not an unusual thing there. I did not say a word to the occupant of this ticket box, just laid down 3 5-cent pieces and hurried by. Through a doorless space, we ushered ourselves into an inner room, absolutely partitionless. The room was oblong in shape, about 30 by 80 feet, to be nearly accurate. At each end 2 windows might have served to give light in the daytime, had it not been for their being covered over by the filth of 50 years, probably, for the building was about that age, and I am confident the walls had never been swept or the windows cleaned since the building was finished. For the purpose of giving some light, however, here and there was suspended from the ceiling the cheapest kind of hanging lamp. Each emitted a horrible odor, which made the atmosphere unspeakably unhealthy. As soon as our eyes became accustomed to the semi-light in the place, we saw ranged all down the room a procession of cots, each of which bore a sleeping form of a lodger. The cots were made in the simplest manner. A frame of soft wood formed the sides and the cross pieces. Then to each end was tacked square pieces of timber, thus raising the cot about 12 inches from the floor. No mattress was thrown on the canvas cover. We were expected to go to bed right on the canvas which made part of your cot. How about bedclothing, do I hear you ask? Bless your unsophisticated life, there was none. 2 gigantic sheet iron stoves at each end of the room were sending out volumes of furnace-like heat. It made the temperature of torrid intensity. Strange as it may seem to you, the heat was really bedclothes. Every lodger, as he entered the room, was supposed to strip off his clothing until he was entirely naked. Then he laid his weary bones down on the canvas of his cot and went to sleep. The heat of the room was supposed to keep him warm, so bedclothing was not necessary. The reason why it was the fashion for lodgers to undress was threefold. Firstly, because it was the style to use the sleeper's clothing for his pillow. Next, because with his clothes under his head, he escaped nameless visitants. And lastly, because the next man to each sleeper was liable to wake up at an inopportune moment and decamp with fellow lodgers' clothing. Dr. Parkhurst gazed round with handkerchief to his nose, for the smell was that of a charnel house. "Have we a Board of Health?" he asked. "I should fancy not, to look around here, the laws being clearly violated." "Clearly violated, Gardner. More human beings are occupying space here than the law allows. It is a dreadful shame and a disgrace upon civilization, my God, to think that people with souls to save like this." In the half-light shed by the stickly, ill-smelling lamps, we saw dozens of naked forms stretched in slumber. Here was a face dark and swarthy, which transplanted you in mind to Italy. There was the fair hair and blonde beard of German, Irishman, Englishman, American, Scotchman, Scandinavians. The cast-off scum of all of Europe and America snored and dreamt in that awful forcing room of crime. Yet, Dr. Parkhurst said, "From just the sad places at the election time comes a host of men to cast their ballots." The political leader and owner of the district in which the lodging house in question is situated is Police Justice Patrick Diver. "I, feeling like revolting against my generation," added the doctor, "when I think that from just such lodging houses are built up political careers. How are you going to root them out? Why, the men whom they put in power are sure to protect the lodging housekeepers." Next, we visited the 10-cent lodging house at number 219 Park Row. Except this place was not quite so filthy as the previous one, it did not in any way differ from it. Dr. Parkhurst and his accompanying devil hunter, Irving, looked curiously around and made many mental notes. At least the doctor did, for he has often spoken of the political pull which can be worked through a cheap Bowery lodging house. He full well understands that from such places along about election time are registered thousands of repeaters and fictitious voters. And they all vote, adds Dr. Parkhurst, for Tammany Hall and municipal corruption. These lodging houses are running still. If you think my picture overdrawn, go and see it for yourself. Faint blushes of the coming sun were gilding the east when we left the last lodging house and arrived to our homes. I fancy that Dr. Parkhurst slept the sleep of the just when he reached home, and awoke, as Irving told me afterward. He did, with a taste in his mouth, as if he had accidentally swallowed a morgue. I know that is the way I felt too. That is where we shall end for now, because we come back on chapter 4. My darlings, I do thank you so much for joining me tonight. This is a fun book. I quite enjoy it. Anyway, my beauties, till next time, love to you. Thank you for all the likes, the comments, and the shares. I'll see you next time.